We're now continuing on with our interval practice, and we're looking at the intervals in the Ionian or major mode, Ionian or major scale this time. And then we want to be able to compare that to all of the other modes. And let's do just a quick recap on why this is important, so that when we do this kind of practice, we can try to get it down and pack as much as possible into as little a time as possible to do kind of our theory work, which I like to do kind of in the morning when my mind is still working, and at least get like 15 minutes in of just trying to work on intervals, which is actually kind of fun if you do it for a while. If you have an Excel spreadsheet, of course, because Excel spreadsheets are fun by nature, and therefore, they're, look how colorful this thing is, right? I mean, it's amazing. So it doesn't really get better than that. You should really, it's something to look forward to, really. Some people just don't like the Excel sheets. I don't know what is wrong with people. What is wrong with people? Look at this thing. This is better than modern art right here. This thing looks like it should be hung on a wall. Any case, where was I? So what are we trying to do? This is the position that typically we would think of as, I would call position number 1, or you might call it a G-shaped C major position, because this would be a G shape in the caged system. So, and if I was to play a pentatonic scale from A to A, it would look like that. 7 note, it would sound like that. So that is a common position that a lot of people learn first, maybe not in fret 5, but they learn it somewhere. I would recommend it be good to learn it here, because that's right in the middle of the guitar, and although you'd be playing in A minor, if you went from A to A, if you went from C to C, you'd be in the related major. And because we're nicely in the middle of the guitar, we have an even amount of space basically behind it, or towards the back of the guitar and towards the body of the guitar, which allows us to understand things and build on it better. So my strategy, by the way, I haven't mentioned this for a while, so let me just kind of point this out, is that I would first want to be memorizing things basically in open position from the standpoint of chords, because that's the most fun thing to do, and because a lot of theory or a lot of playing up the guitar will be based on those chord shapes. You can use the caged system, or at least 2 components of the caged system, which is going to be the E major shape, the E minor shape, the A major shape, the A minor shape, to then have movable chords up the guitar. So that's great. So you want to play here. That's the most fun thing to do, to play, to just be jamming around with open chords. And then I would say the next thing you want to do is learn in the middle of the guitar. Why? Because then you're able to grow naturally from side to side. I want to be able to say, when I'm working on scale shapes and whatnot, I'd like to be able to imagine I can build my understanding to both to the right and to the left of the shape. And so that's why I want to be in the middle of the guitar when I'm learning shapes. And then when I learn shapes, or when I learn how to play in the middle of the guitar, we can do that by either we learn the pattern, which would be a scale pattern, or you can think of the caged patterns as another kind of pattern that fits into the scale patterns. We can also think of it by building the formula, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, from the perspective of the C, and then altering that, which I might look at more. That's the one I used possibly least, and is possibly most complex on a guitar, given the fact that it's not in a linear format as is the piano. And then, of course, we're going to work on the intervals, which is what we are doing here, so that I can construct around any center point the intervals. Now, we typically do that, of course, with the the Ionian or major scale. That's just a convention in Western music, so you might as well go with that, because that's what everybody does. And so I'm going to build it on the Ionian scale. So I want to learn these intervals backwards and forwards. I want to understand them completely, so that I can then use that as my Rosetta Stone, comparing all other modes basically to it. So and I can also do that with the shape, by the way. I can learn this shape as the major. I can think of it as the major scale and all related modes fitting within it, and then I can make small alterations to it to get to all the other modes. That's another way I can kind of visualize what I'm trying to do here. So most of the time we measure things. We often learn the top two strings, kind of like a piano, and we learn them as though they are piano keys, right? And we just say, even though I can't see the black keys to help me out, I know the pattern of whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, or I'm just going to memorize the top two strings on which notes I can play. And then I can build onto that, adding the fifth, the easiest thing, power chord, and then build onto that, possibly adding the third being more difficult because we have major third or minor thirds, those being the defining characteristics, the difference between chords typically. So we start to memorize that the 1, 4, 5, the blues progression are all the majors. The 2, 3, and 6 are the minors, and the Locrian's the funny one, which I would call a minor with a flat fifth. So it's still kind of a minor in essence, but you can't play the fifth on it. That's the problem with that one. But then that's great, but that only helps for the 1, 3, 5, and it only helps you to know what to play if you're in the Ionian mode or major scale. If I switch to the Dorian mode, all that's happening is I'm making the D, the 1, all the notes are the same. What I can do to try to tie it to my Rosetta Stone, the major scale, is to label the modes based on the relative positions to the major scale. So therefore, I would call the Dorian mode number 2, and therefore I know that it's going to be building a chord based on the 2 note of the relative major scale, which means it would be a minor chord, and then I can look at all the other positions relative to the 1 of the Dorian and look at the relative positions to the major scale, which can at least give me a Rosetta Stone to kind of understand which of these notes I would then be building a major chord or a minor chord from. Now, I'd like to go beyond that, however, and also note I don't want to just do the 1, 3, 5. I'd want to be able to know which 7, 9, 11, and 13, the 9, 11, and 13 being equivalent to the 2, 4, and 6, which of those would fit into the key I'm playing in. And to know that, I not only need to know that it would build a major or minor chord, have a major or minor third from that position, I also need to then know, in essence, the modes. So you kind of have to know the modes if you want to know what you're doing as to when I can add a 7, 9, 11, and 13 to a particular chord. So that's kind of what we're going to build on here. So we're learning the intervals of the major, the C major, measuring around this point, noting that a lot of times we don't think about building the intervals from a note down here on the fretboard. It becomes more difficult than doing it up here on the C up top. Why? Because when I measure from up here and I move down, looking at the intervals, I can more easily see my bar shapes, which are going to be, if I'm on the top string, an E major or an E minor. If I'm on the bottom string, if you don't understand what I'm saying on these caged shapes, that's okay. I'm just saying this is the caged system would be on the top 2 strings oftentimes, or you just call them bar chords, which are basically equivalent to the E shape and then the A major and A minor shape from here. Also, when I'm looking at these intervals up top and I'm measuring the distance moving down, I don't need to look at the inverse distance. That makes it easier. Whereas if I'm looking at this C over here, and I'm trying to build a chord from the notes above it, on the strings above it, which would be an inverted chord, but I want to look at this as my root point, I have to look at the inverse distance, which most people don't know how to do because we barely know how to count things out when I'm moving down on the fretboard, because most people don't even know the distance between 2 strings because it's not laid out like a piano. And the conventions on the intervals are kind of confusing because they don't really tell you. And you got this tectonic plate shift up here that throws everything off. So that's what we want to practice. We'll practice the inverse distances when we measure above it. We also have the problem down here of being right next to the fault line. So when I'm up here, I'm on this entire continent that doesn't have a difference between the strings. We haven't hit the fault line. But when I'm down here, I've got this fault line that's always present that's going to mess up all my shapes. So we really want to understand this position and measure from around here. That gives us good practice to deal with what happens across the fault line. And that allows us to build things not only by shape, but I can actually count it out if I wanted to. If I want to prove what's happening to myself, I could say, well, is this really a minor chord? Well, I can say, well, where's my root? And let me count out the third and see where the third is. And I won't be thrown off by the fault line, and I can figure out my chords that way, right? So it's a useful tool. So we're going to be continuing on measuring around this C note.